She believed that she was in control. She believed that she was fulfilling her duties. However, when Officer Linda Carson strikes a black motorist during a routine stop, she discovers the hard way that presumption can destroy everything. Officer Linda Carson was quite pleased with the peaceful night so far, a shift she was willing to endure. The time was just past 10 p.m., and the majority of traffic in this area of Columbus had slowed to a trickle. She sat in her cruiser, which was parked in close proximity to a vacant lot, and observed the infrequent vehicle passing by. An elegant black sedan was observed gliding through the intersection in front of her. It was one of those costly models that appeared to be affixed to the driveway of a CEO. Nothing about it appeared to be out of place, with the exception of a minor detail, the absence of a turn signal. In a technical sense, it was a violation. A trivial issue, yes, but still a valid reason to halt the motor. And perhaps Linda felt the need to remind individuals that rules were rules. She entered the street, accelerating just enough to reduce the distance. Her lights were briefly illuminated. The sedan slowed, and then effortlessly moved over to the side, causing its brake lights to flare. Linda took her time exiting the building, with one hand holding her belt and the other adjusting her radio. There was a calm atmosphere on the street. The only sound is the faint hum of streetlights above, and the occasional vehicle in the distance. The glass rolled down with an almost deliberate delay as she approached the driver's side window. And there he was, a black male in his mid-40s, with a crisply trimmed beard and a navy suit that was well tailored. He appeared to be wealthy, as if he was aware that he belonged in a vehicle of this caliber. His fingers scarcely twitched as he gazed at her, and his hands were resting calmly on the steering wheel. Linda experienced a sensation of constriction in her thorax. She was not fond of the manner in which he regarded her. "I am not anxious. I am not contrite. Just expecting registration and license." Her voice was more forceful than was necessary. The man blinks once before reaching toward his glove compartment in a methodical, controlled manner, as if he already knew what she was thinking. "Officer, may I inquire as to the reason for my detention?" His voice was silky, even. Linda crossed her arms, failed to indicate a turn in that direction. "A beat has been delivered." A tranquil exhalation. "Did I?" Her gaze briefly traversed him. Something about his demeanor. It was not disrespectful. He was not particularly aggressive. However, it was difficult in a manner that she did not appreciate. She reiterated, "Registration and license." Without further words, he transferred them. His movements were consistent. No handshakes, no urgent justification. She briefly examined the identification card, scarcely recognizing the name before discarding it. She was irritated by that attitude, calm and confident. "Do you reside in the vicinity?" she inquired. The individual exhaled through his nasal passage. A mere exhalation, yet sufficient to resemble a declaration. "I fail to comprehend how that is pertinent." Linda's grasp on his identification card became increasingly tense. She had served on the force for more than a decade, which was sufficient time to become aware of when someone was not treating her with the respect she deserved. Long enough to identify instances in which an individual believed they could evade consequences. She adjusted her posture. "Exit the vehicle." The individual's demeanor underwent its initial transformation. His mandible was fixed. His cranium is slightly inclined. "What is the reason?" "I requested that you withdraw." A muscle in his cheek twitched. However, he refrained from disputing the matter. He simply exhaled, unbuckled his seatbelt, and pushed the door open. Linda retreated as he rose. She was surprised by his height. Broad-shouldered, his demeanor was devoid of tension and aggression. However, her pulse increased in response to his presence. She directed her hand toward the rear of the vehicle. "Place your hands on the trunk." The man exhaled once more through his nose. Before turning to position his palms flat against the cold metal, he took a slow, deliberate breath. Linda's heart beat rapidly. She could now sense the change in authority. This was her opportunity to remind him of her authority. She advanced, placing a hand on his back and gently lowering him. He became tense, and that was the moment when something within her snapped. Her palm struck his cheek before she had the opportunity to contemplate the situation. A piercing, stinging detonation reverberated throughout the deserted street. The man's head abruptly swung to the side. His body freezes entirely. Silence. Dense. Excessive. Linda's own respiration became constricted. The world seemed to stand still for a brief period. Then gradually, he turned his attention back to her. His visage was impenetrable. He only clenched his mandible, once before he resumed breathing steadily. He then reached into his jacket pocket with the utmost control and intention. Linda's stomach contorted. He produced his identification card. Supported it. Nathaniel Grant. The title beneath his name caught her attention, as she flickered her eyes. Chief of Police. Her superior. Linda's pulse sounded like a cacophony in her ears. Her digits became paralyzed. The ground beneath her felt as though it had recently ruptured. Nathaniel Grant observed her from a position directly in front of her. However, this was far from the conclusion. Linda experienced a sensation of her body becoming rigid. It was as though her intellect was unable to comprehend the information that her eyes were presenting. Chief of Police. Not your average law enforcement officer. Not merely an administrative officer, or a detective from a different precinct. Her superior. She had assaulted her supervisor. Nathaniel Grant continued to display his identification card. His expression remained unchanged, despite the fact that his digits were loose around the margins. He was not incensed. He did not request an explanation. He was merely gazing at her. In some respects that was even more detrimental. Suddenly, Linda's respiration was cut short. Her mind was awash with a dozen competing ideas, none of which emerged as words. She could hear her own heartbeat, which resounded against her ribcage, like a rhythm. "I, Chief Grant." She ceased. There was no viable method of concluding that sentence. "I cannot provide an explanation that would not appear to be frantic." A voice broke through the dense silence. "Is everything proceeding smoothly, Officer Carson?" She made an abrupt detour. The blue and red lights of another patrol vehicle had illuminated the pavement in a jumbled pattern, as it had approached her. Officer Reynolds, her customary companion, was standing a mere few feet away, his eyebrows drawn together in bewilderment. Linda opened her mouth. However, Grant spoke first. "No problem," he replied with aplomb, relocating his identification card to his pocket. The officer in question was merely conducting a traffic stop. Reynolds' gaze narrowed as he looked between them. "Sir, Grant failed to look at him. His attention was fixed on Linda. He inquired, "Am I permitted to depart?" Linda halted. Her fingertips twitched at her sides. This concluded the matter. This was the moment. Respond affirmatively. Permit him to depart. I trust that he will refrain from filing a report, or attempting to regain control by doubling down. Her lips were moist. "I am." Grant's larynx produced a low snicker. "Not for amusement. I am not angry. I am experiencing a chill." He asked, "Officer Carson, are you detaining me?" With a slight inclination of his head. Linda's perplexity transitioned to concern as she felt the weight of Reynolds' gaze. He was unaware of the events that transpired. Her throat was scorched by the words. "No, sir." Grant exhaled slowly and deliberately before casting a glance at Reynolds. "It is encouraging to observe that the department continues to employ professionals." Subsequently, he returned to his vehicle, seated himself in the driver's seat, and closed the door without speaking. Linda was rendered immobile as the black sedan gradually re-entered the roadway and vanished into the darkness. But as soon as the vehicle vanished, Reynolds turned to her. "Linda, what was that?" She perceived her mandible contracting. It was merely a brief stop. Reynolds' eyebrows arched. "Is this merely a pit stop? You appear to have observed an apparition. What did he say to you?" "Nothing. That was the issue." Grant had not issued any statements, no cautions, no threats. A protracted silence that devastated her more than any amount of screaming could. She shook her head. "There is nothing. Ignore it." Reynolds continued to observe her for an additional second before finally exhaling. "I will document the stop. Are you doing well?" Linda ingested. Was she? Certainly. He hesitated before nodding and returning to his cruiser. Linda turned to her own, but as she reached for the door handle, she felt a weighty sensation settle in her stomach. Nathaniel Grant had permitted her to depart. There is no scenario, no imminent repercussions. However, he had not yet concluded his relationship with her. She was aware of this. That night, Linda struggled to obtain adequate sleep. She reclined in her bed, gazing at the ceiling and reliving the event. The manner in which Grant had regarded her. The manner in which he had relinquished her. There is to be no commotion. There are no concerns, no imminent repercussions. Just that silence. Heavy, deliberate, It would have been simpler if he had shouted, easier if he had humiliated her immediately, and pulled rank. At the very least, she would have been aware of her position. However, she was instead left to wait. Her stomach was so constricted that it caused her discomfort by morning. She dressed, her hands trembling as she fastened her uniform. It is possible that it will dissipate. Grant may have elected not to disclose the information. Perhaps. Her telephone vibrated. The Internal Affairs Department of the precinct has issued a single message. Immediately, report to the chief's office. Linda's breath was trapped in her lungs. It was occurring. She proceeded to the station in stillness, her hand firmly gripping the steering wheel. She could immediately sense that there were eyes on her. As soon as she entered the building, officers are observed loitering near the refreshment room. The clerk at the front desk was scarcely able to raise her head. She was aware of the mechanics of these matters. Despite the fact that no words had been spoken, the word was always disseminated. In the elevator, she ascended, the seconds elongating into seemingly endless hours. It seemed that the hallway leading to Grant's office was considerably lengthier than it ought to have been. She compelled herself to exhale, as she grasped the handle, and entered. Grant was perusing a file at his workstation. He did not raise his head. However, another individual had already arrived. A man who had been with the department for more than 20 years, Captain Howard, stood to the side with his arms crossed, and an inscrutable expression. The air in the area fluctuated. Grant finally raised his head. "Officer Carson," he said at a consistent pace. "Sit." As she sank into the chair across from him, her legs felt tense. Grant's hands were clasped together, as he reclined. His visage failed to disclose any information. "Remain composed. Quantified. In charge." Then, after an extended period of silence, he finally spoke. He inquired, his voice silky yet firm, "How would you describe the stop that occurred last night?" Linda ingested. "An examination." His esophagus was parched. "Stopped the routine in the event of a signal failure." Grant nodded, as if anticipating the response. "And what transpired subsequent to that?" Her hearing vibrated with her pulse. He refrained from increasing his voice. "There was no insistent pressure. I am currently awaiting. You requested identification. The motorist was unwilling to cooperate." Grant's eyebrows raised significantly. "Uncooperative." Linda's mandible was clenched. He inquired as to the rationale behind his detention. A moment of silence ensued. Grant addressed Captain Howard. "Do you believe that questioning an officer is considered uncooperative?" Howard's eyes scarcely moved. "Not unless the driver refuses to comply." Grant's gaze returned to her. "Did I refuse to comply, Officer Carson?" Linda's palms penetrated her thighs. "No, sir." Grant nodded, as he exhaled through his nostrils. The moment she had been dreading occurred when her midsection contorted. She endeavored to maintain a consistent tone in her voice. "The suspect was struck by me." "Are you suspicious?" Grant reiterated. His tone became more incisive. Linda declined to respond. Grant examined her before bending forward, his forearms resting on his desk. "Officer Carson, what was the reason for your physical assault on me?" The inquiry penetrated her like a harpoon. Howard maintained his silence, his attention fixed on her. The words did not emerge, despite the fact that her lips parted. Grant's voice remained unwavering. However, a chilling sensation persisted beneath it. "Were you in any way intimidated?" "No, sir." "Did I resist?" "No, sir." "Did I offend you?" Linda's stomach was in a state of agitation. Grant maintained her gaze. "Subsequently, what precisely caused you to strike me?" "The walls were too near, and the chamber appeared to be too small." Her vocal cords became paralyzed. Grant murmured, "You do not possess an answer." He did not shout, did not refer to her as a racist, and did not say anything that she had not already considered throughout the evening. Rather, he permitted the stillness to overwhelm her. Grant eventually regained his composure. Inhaling, he proceeded to slide a single sheet of paper across the desk. Her heart ceased to beat. "A notice of suspension." He merely stated, "You are off duty until further notice." Linda's hands trembled as she reached for it. Chief Grant." However, he was already standing. Rejected. Linda experienced an overwhelming sensation of sinking. She stood, scarcely recalling how to walk.
She felt as though her legs were not connected to her body, despite the fact that she scarcely noticed Captain Howard opening the door for her. Grant spoke one final time as she exited. "We are not yet finished." She was aware that he was sincere. Linda remained seated on her settee, gazing at the suspension notice that was in her possession. She had reviewed it at least 10 times. However, the wording remained unchanged. Indefinite administrative leave pending review.
Her chest felt the weight of it. In the 15 years she had served on the force, she had never been suspended. There was nothing she could do but wait. On the coffee table, her phone vibrated. There was a brief moment when she considered disregarding it. However, upon observing the screen, her stomach plummeted. Nathaniel Grant. She hesitated, her fingertips poised over the screen, before ultimately responding. "Carson." A moment of silence. "I would like to meet you at Riverside Park." 10 minutes. She was unable to express herself during the call. As she donned her jacket and exited the building, her pulse was erratic. Upon her arrival, Riverside Park was virtually devoid of individuals. A couple resting on a bench, a few individuals jogging, and a man strolling his dog. The streetlights flickered against the pavement, casting lengthy shadows. He was then visible to her. Nathaniel Grant stood at the park's perimeter, his hands tucked into his pockets, as he observed the river flow beneath the bridge. He did not raise his head as she approached. She briefly entertained the possibility of departing. However, her feet continued to move, as a result of the inscrutable, placid demeanor with which he stood. She halted a few feet away. "You reached out to me," she replied. Grant continued to bow, but his gaze was not directed toward her. "Are you aware of the reason I refrained from reporting you to IA?" Linda ingested. She had asked herself why the matter had been conducted in such a subdued manner. Grant finally turned to confront her. "Because I desired for you to contemplate it initially." "Feel it." Her mandible contracted. "Yes, I do." "No, you do not." The weight of his voice was undeniable, despite its levelness. "Not yet." Linda crossed her arms. Subsequently, "What is this?" Grant conducted an extended examination of her. Prior to approaching a settee, he inclined his head. "Sit." She hesitated, but his tone made it evident that this was not a request. She reclined. He proceeded, resting his elbows on his knees and gazing out at the water. Afterward, he addressed the audience. "Have you ever been pulled over, Carson?" Linda blinks. "What is this?" A routine halt. Grant elaborated. "Have you ever been stopped by a police officer who flashed their lights, inquired about your license, or inquired about your destination?" She shook her head. "I am referring to perhaps once or twice." Grant exhaled through his nostrils. "I have lost track." Linda's abdomen contracted. "I have been stopped by the police in every city I have lived in, and they have asked me why I was there, even in my own neighborhood," he continued. Linda was at a loss as to what to say. Grant reclined against the settee. "You struck me out of frustration. However, consider the following. What was the reason for my frustration with you?"
She was aware of the solution.
She simply did not wish to express it. Grant did not absolve her of responsibility. "Because I did not exhibit any signs of fear toward you." She felt a tightness in her chest. "You anticipated that I would be anxious to locate my pocketbook in a hurry." Grant observed her intently, and he stated, "To present myself as somehow guilty. And when I refrained from reacting, when I maintained my composure, it caused you to become angry." Linda experienced a parched sensation in her pharynx. Grant shook his head. "Do you not perceive it? The extent of its depth is not apparent to you."
She tightened her mandible. "I am not,"
Grant concluded for her, "not racist. It is possible that it is not. However, what term do you use to describe the situation in which you presume that an individual is a menace solely because they are alive?" The words struck with force. Neither of them spoke for an extended period of time. The silence was filled with the distant hum of the metropolis and the noises of the river. Grant finally exhaled. "I did not request that you come to this location with the intention of tearing you apart. I requested your presence here because you are faced with a decision." Linda averted her gaze. "What alternative is available?" Grant's expression was imperceptible as he turned toward her. "You have the option to disregard this and convince yourself that it was merely an error." The weight of his voice was undeniable, despite its quietness. "Or you may choose to sit with it. Sit down and contemplate the event. and inquire as to why it transpired. Linda gazed away, her eyes fixed on the water. Grant maintained his position. When Internal Affairs summons you back, they will inquire whether you have acquired any new knowledge. He retreated. Determine your response. And with that he departed. Linda remained seated, observing his back vanish into the darkness. The first time since the halt, she allowed herself to experience the full weight of her actions. However, this was not yet concluded. Linda endured oppressive silence for the subsequent 3 days. Her telephone was scarcely audible. No updates, no messages from her usual work friends, no calls from the precinct. It was as though she had been completely eradicated from the department overnight. She should have been relieved, should have been appreciative of the opportunity to reflect. However, the issue was with the mind. Nathaniel Grant's words embedded themselves in her mind like oil. You have the option to either flee from this situation and convince yourself that it was merely an error, or you can confront it. She had assured herself that she was not that type of officer. No, she had never been irresponsible. She should never allow her emotions to dictate her actions. However, that evening, she had. And now the weight of it would not relinquish its grip. The message was eventually received on the 4th day. Linda's palms were clammy as she grasped the steering wheel and drove to the station, holding the Internal Affairs report. Despite the sun's presence, the cold in her stomach persisted. Upon entering, she was once again struck by the presence of eyes, officers seated at their workstations, exchanging a few glimpses amid hushed conversations. They were aware. Her head was bowed as she proceeded to the conference room. The door was already unlocked. 3 individuals were seated within the building: Captain Howard, an IA investigator, named Harris, and Nathaniel Grant. He did not acknowledge her as she entered. Rather, he maintained his hands folded on the table and continued to gaze at the file in front of him. Linda forced a firm intake and sat. Harris leaned forward.
Officer Carson.
Let us discuss the interruption that occurred last week. Her esophagus was parched. Yes, sir. According to your statement, Harris continued, perusing the documents, you stopped the driver for failing to signal. Is that accurate? Yes, sir. Harris agreed. And at what point did you resort to physical force? Linda's stomach contorted. Grant's silence was as audible as the query itself. She could sense his presence across the table. She swallowed. I struck the driver, after instructing him to exit the vehicle. Why? The phrase struck with force. Linda had rehearsed this in her mind 100 times, but abruptly, every justification and excuse felt hollow. Her lips were in close contact. I erupted in anger. Captain Howard adjusted in his seat. Harris raised his eyebrow slightly, as if he had not anticipated her to express herself in such a straightforward manner. He flipped to a different page. You expressed your belief that the driver was being uncooperative in this context. Linda's hands were clenched into fists beneath the table. She inhaled. I mistakenly believed that he was resisting, but he was not. Grant gazed upward for the first time. Their gaze intersected. Assumed. He reiterated. The weight of that word was felt by Linda. There was an extended period of silence between them. Harris then cleared his throat. Chief Grant, are there any additional comments you would like to make? Grant reclined in his recliner. He briefly observed her before exhaling. Not yet. The file was terminated by Harris. Officer Carson, this is our current location. You have served on the force for 15 years without incurring any disciplinary action. This is advantageous for you. Nevertheless, this was an unjustified use of force. That is an issue that cannot be disregarded. Linda's pulse increased. Harris continued. You are anticipating a minimum of 60 days of unpaid suspension. Furthermore, you will be required to participate in bias and de-escalation training. Termination will be the consequence of a subsequent offense of this nature. Linda exhaled gradually. The news was not exactly favorable, but it was not the end of the world either. She agreed. Comprehension. Harris gathered his files as he stood. The paperwork will be finalized. You have been terminated. Linda rose from her seat, however. Grant did not move. He gazed at her, his expression impossible to interpret. Then, as she approached the door, he finally spoke. Carson. She ceased. Grant's tone was composed and even. However, the significance of it was undeniable. This is not the conclusion. Linda refrained from turning around. She simply grasped the doorknob, forcing herself to exhale, as she was aware that he was correct. Additionally, the actual labor had not yet commenced. Linda was seated in her vehicle outside the station, her hands clenched so tightly that they turned white. 60 days. There is no compensation. Bias instruction. It could have been significantly worse. It ought to have been more detrimental. Anger was anticipated by her. Resentment. Perhaps she even felt a sense of relief that she had not lost her job entirely. However, none of those emotions manifested. However, there was an object that was considerably heavier, something that she had been evading since Grant first held her gaze that evening. Shame. She had made an assumption. She had responded. She had abused her authority, and she had escaped with a mere tap on the wrist. Grant was correct. This was not the conclusion. Not by a long stretch. Embarrassing was the initial day of training. The room was compact, with approximately 12 additional officers present, a mix of novices and veterans. There was a lack of conversation. No one desired to attend. Joanna Pierce, an elderly black woman, was the instructor. Her expression was unintelligible as she surveyed the room. Then, she operated the remote control for the projector. A video of a traffic encounter was exhibited. Linda observed in silence. Although the footage was indistinct and captured from a body camera, the narrative was unambiguous. A minor infraction resulted in a black man being hauled over. The officer, who was also Caucasian, escalated the situation. Sharpness of voice. Abrupt tone. The male maintained the visibility of his palms. The tone of his voice was serene. However, it was of no consequence. The officer's frustration intensified. Tension is increasing. The officer then seized him. The video concluded, and the room fell silent. Joanna crossed her arms. Let us discuss our presumptions. No one spoke. She allowed the silence to persist before turning. Her gaze fixed on Linda. Carson, she said, her voice even. What did the officer observe when he stopped that individual? Linda's larynx contracted. She was aware of the solution. She whispered, he perceived a danger. Joanna agreed. And what did you observe when you pulled over Chief Grant? Linda's breath was oppressive. The words were scarcely audible. A potential hazard. Joanna inclined her head. And was he? Linda ingested. No. Joanna's voice was now quieter, and she slightly leaned forward. Subsequently, where did that concept originate? She was consumed by the inquiry. From what source did it originate? Was it the manner in which she had been instructed? The subtle messages that have been accumulated over the years? The notion that specific individuals, in specific locations, did not belong? Linda had dedicated her entire professional life to convincing herself that she was not prejudiced, that she treated all individuals equally. However, that evening with Grant had demonstrated something she was reluctant to acknowledge. It was untrue. She did not possess an answer at this time. But for the first time, she was not averting her gaze from the inquiry. Joanna maintained her gaze for an additional moment, before she nodded. Excellent. Linda exhaled, unaware that she had been suppressing her breath. This was the first time since that night that she was not resisting the truth. She was confronted with it. Linda returned to the precinct 2 months later. It was as though everything was identical, yet simultaneously distinct. The typical station ambience was characterized by the low murmur of officers exchanging reports, the sound of boots striking tile, and the tinkling of phones. However, there was an underlying presence. Not out of pity or judgment, but rather out of curiosity. Individuals observed her. She absolved them of any responsibility. She proceeded to her workstation, and placed her belongings there. However, a shadow passed by before she could sit. Nathaniel Grant. He persisted in his actions, did not express any sentiments. I have just begun to walk toward his office. However, he hesitated at the door. He inclined his head slightly. Carson. She became tense. Sir. A moment of silence. Then welcome back. Linda ingested. Thank you. Grant nodded once before entering his office, and closing the door behind him.
Linda breathed for the first time in weeks. A second opportunity had been granted to her. She was responsible for determining what she would do with it. Prejudice is not always audible. It is not always accompanied by explicit hostility or derogatory language. Sometimes, it is quite. At times they are mere assumptions. Decisions made in a matter of seconds, solely based on fear and conditioning. The inquiry does not pertain to its existence. The inquiry is, are you prepared to confront it? In the event that you are, what actions will you take to address the situation? Share this narrative, if it provoked thought. Let us engage in the discussions that are truly significant.